everyone. Welcome to the Freedom Journey. Today's is going to be a little bit different. I have a question I'm going to ask Clyde that many of you have also either asked or have thought and wondered about. And so, Clyde, I know over the years you've had some harsh critics, but it's not hard to miss your non-response. Why is that?
Hey, well, yeah. Well, thanks for asking. I have a lot of friends, and they hear some criticism of the things that we teach, and as friends are concerned about you, and they want to defend you, and so a lot of times I get asked, "Oh, did you?" From well-meaning saints, did you hear about so and so who's said this and that about you, and and again, rightfully, well-meaningly, they're very concerned about that, and I do appreciate their concern, but I'll tell you what, one of the foundational truths to me in as far as my deportment goes, as far as my life, the way I live my life, and the way I conduct my ministry, is a couple statements by Paul, one to Timothy and one to Titus. And he writes to Timothy and he says, not to be quarrelsome, but lenient and pacific. And then in writing to Titus along the same theme and topic, he says to be culminating no one, to be pacific, lenient, displaying all meekness toward all humanity. One of the wonderful things about the concordant version and other literal versions, you probably heard me say this before, is I was King James only, born and raised that way, and that way for much of my early ministry. And I had the King James so memorized that even when I was reading it, I really wasn't reading it. I was just reciting it in my head. And the truths were, any truths that were possibly available sort of got washed over my head because I already knew what the verses said. And so these literal translations or even just alternate translations, can be very good that they slow you down, or they use a word especially that you're not familiar with or you're used to reading. It's probably very beneficial, it has been for me, to read lots of versions, especially literal, but lots of versions, just to see what different words might attract your attention, that maybe you missed something. And in both of these instructions to both Timothy and Titus, the concordant version uses this word Pacific, same as Pacific Ocean, and except, of course, not talking about the ocean on the west coast of the United States, but talking about a character, about an attribute. And when you go back in the keyword concordance in the back, you'll see that the structure of this Greek word that gets translated Pacific, which, by the way, Pacific means calm and peaceful. And so this word that's translated that, the Greek makeup starts with the word fighting, and then it has the prefix un in front of it, unfighting. So if you go back in the keyword concordance and look up the word Pacific, you're going to see the structure unfighting. We don't fight. Now, some people relate that to being anti-war, anti-government policy, and surely there's some merit there. You know, um, we can see the merit of not just slaughtering people and destroying people. Um, but in this context, it's about ministry. And our ministry is not about fighting. We are unfighters. We are non-fighters. Now, there is an aspect of fighting that we have that Paul uses the analogy of a fighter. But he says that we don't wrestle. We don't fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and mights. It's a spiritual warfare that we're involved in, not a physical fleshly warfare that we're involved in. Now, Stephen Hill has a wonderful video series and BSN articles, and he has a book on the celestial realm. Very important. So there is a battle going on, but it has nothing to do with any humanity. It has nothing to do with the people around us, whether they're believers or unbelievers, whatever their cause. We are ministers of conciliation. We are ministers that are at peace. We're about grace and peace. And as it says here, to be culminating no one, to be pacific, lenient, displaying all meekness toward all humanity. The only way I know for these injunctions, for these displays of ideal life as a believer and as a teacher and as those ministering to the saints, the only way I know these is to take these at face value, and that our goal is not to be fighting and struggling against people, but loving them and being kind and gracious to them. And if someone is going to be a critic and they're going to be an agitator and they're going to try to stir up controversy, I don't see my role. I don't see our role as joining in on that conflict. If there's a fight going on in a boxing ring, we don't have to participate in it. We can be free from that. And so this is my response. My response is unfighting. My response is no response. And let me go over just real briefly just 3 issues to me that have brought me to this place. I've not always been here. I used to, in my young days in the ministry, in my immaturity, my childish spiritual nature, if someone said something, I saw it as an attack on the truth. And it was my job to defend the truth, and perhaps defend my reputation, because they're going to mess up my reputation, And I realized over time, in the absolute sovereignty of God, that God's truth is never in danger and never in need of me coming to its defense. And neither my reputation, because what is that? I mean, Paul's reputation was he was the offscouring of the earth. He didn't have a good reputation, and his reputation went out very poorly. And if those are our concerns, do we really even understand the sovereignty of God? And the fact is that God wrote the story of the critic and the antagonist just as much as he wrote the story of grace and peace and kindness. And it's a contrast, And if you can understand this, I know Knox said, it's just a shame for a teacher of God, not to be opposed. It's a shame that he doesn't have opposition. So my first answer to that is that I view my life and ministry as my response. My life is my response to my critics. My ministry, the things I teach and believe, they are the response. I don't need to stop what I'm doing and respond. Um, in fact, well, I'm just going to say it. It's really humorous to me when I hear of critics who are telling me what I believe. It's humorous. Okay. Now, other people say, "Oh my goodness," but lies are being said, and you're being misrepresented. But see, you and I, as we've already talked about, Steve, in this freedom journey, is we get to look beyond the circumstances. And what do we see? In all things, we see God behind the circumstance. We know God's in charge of this. And I'll tell you what, when I hear when people tell me, you know, I don't ever go to those sources. Okay, um, I don't. I don't honor them with that. And but when people tell me about things I believe, I have to chuckle. Because even when they're almost close to what I believe, it's so distorted. I'm like, wow, you don't know the half of it. Uh, it was reported recently, that I, don't believe that I believe that half of Paul's epistles don't belong to us. And I'm like, man, you know what? I only believe two epistles. So even when the accusation is presented as he has this outrageous belief, they don't even get that part right. So anyway, so it makes me smile, really. And I appreciate brothers, well-meaning brothers who are take it very personally that someone is saying something about what we believe. But here's the one thing I know: Father's in control. you know I'm doing my part, and even our critics, they're doing their part. And it's all good. Everybody's perfectly where they belong to be. I'm not trying to get anybody to do anything. I'm not trying to get anybody to stop doing anything. And neither do I have to, like, be a responder to other people's script. That I stay on my script. You know, uh, one way to say it is stay in your lane. Don't be weaving back and forth all over the highway. Stay on the route God has you on. Um, and the funny part is, I know our critics, my critics in general, um, they really don't know what those they're criticizing actually believe. We call this the straw man. And one thing's really clear to me when I do hear about what my critics say, is that they really don't investigate or follow my teaching. They're just, yeah. And we're not even worried about what motivates that. Could be a lot of things, but I know what ultimately motivates that, and that's divine energy. to follow the script that they have, and that's okay. I'm good with that. I'm good with I have to be good with that. That's what Father wrote, and so beautiful. And then the second of all, it's the least trifle to me. Now, I've not always been here. 1 Corinthians 4, 3, the King James says, um, but with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Or as the concordance says, now to me it is the least trifle, that I may be being examined by you, or by man's day. Now, I'll be honest with you. When I was young in the faith and just immature, what people thought about me was huge. And what people said about me was huge. It had a big impact on me. In fact, it could be devastating. Anybody's opinion of me could bring my world crashing down, because who I was in a great way tied to someone else's esteem of me. But when we realize through these glorious truths that we have God esteem, He's the only one who matters. The script writer is the only, and even my mistakes and are things I believe, can they be criticized? Of course, because I hold error. I'm fallible, and so. But even those aren't disturbing because I'm on God's journey, and I'm open to ideas and understandings that are different than mine. So while I used to be obsessed with what people thought about me or said about me, I will be honest with you that for some the last couple decades of my life, the previous decade of that, through a series of circumstances, that began about 30 years ago, God finally weaned me from the opinions of others and the criticism of others. And I was able to get to this place where I'm literally not interested in what my critics have to say, nor am I bothered by it. Of course, nor am I surprised by it. I know that's the way it works. And I know who I am. I know who's written my life. I know where my studies have led me and love this place that God has brought me. I know that my studies, if I live longer, will take me even to a more beautiful place and to a clearer place. And I'm good with that. And Adler said this: don't waste your time trying to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. There's no end to it. The controversy never ends. And the best thing we can do is, as Solomon would tell us, is not to respond to mockers. And so we just keep on our course. So the first thing is, my life and my ministry are my response. And second of all, it's least trifle what anybody says or thinks about me. I don't keep tabs on that. Years ago, I used to. When the internet was first out, I would Google myself to see who was after me. And then, and then here comes the point. I have too many important things to do than to try to track down my critics and hear what they have to say. I have important things to study. I have important things to teach, to be distracted by critics and antagonists. That can consume my valuable time. And I can get busy doing that. And then I can't dig out and continue to mine the gold and the jewels of Scripture. So I just keep focused, keep my blinders on, keep in my lane, keep doing what God gave me to do instead of being enticed to be involved in someone else's script for me. And so I continue to study, I continue to share my journey, and it's about a goal of freedom, a goal of peace, a goal of grace, which is joy. These are the goals, of my teaching and the way I live, my family life, of my ministry is to liberate people and make them free. And so you always say, okay, if I responded, is this a furtherance of love, a furtherance of grace, a furtherance of freedom and joy, or do I stay on task? Now I'll tell you, probably my greatest encouragement for a few decades now has been from Nehemiah. And God gave, there was a disgrace and a shame of God's name in Israel because their identity as a nation had been shamed, and the city of Jerusalem in shambles, and the wall around Jerusalem gone. And so this task was given to Nehemiah to start a restoration of the image of God in the testimony of Israel to the nations. And it began by rebuilding the wall. And that was Nehemiah's task. Got to rebuild this wall. And so with a trowel in his hand and a sword by his side, he and those who were his associates are just busy building the wall. And we watch the operation of the adversary in this story. One day I'd like to take an hour or so and go over Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, because it's fabulous. And so we watch the work of the adversary against Nehemiah. And the work of the adversary is to get Nehemiah to stop doing his job, to stop building the wall. And so all these people come whose goal is to distract him, to get him to stop, to get him actually even to come down off the wall and have a conversation. Let's talk about this. And I love this one verse from Nehemiah. And so maybe ultimately, Steve, this is the answer to your question. The answer to the question why I don't even recognize my critics or answer them is the same answer why Nehemiah didn't come down off the wall and talk to this ever flow of people who were trying to get him to stop doing what God had given him to do. God's given me something to do, and I'm not going to be distracted from that. I'm going to stay the course that, by his grace that he's written for me. And here was Nehemiah's response. Nehemiah 6:3. This is hanging on the wall of my heart, this verse, for a few decades now. I should hang it up here in the office. Here's what Nehemiah's response was. I am doing a great work, so I can't come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? I love that. It's awesome. So I could spend countless hours tracking down my critics and responding to them point by point, how they've misrepresented me and they've got this all wrong. Or I could just keep building the wall, restoring as it would be relatively the integrity of God and the joy of God and the peace of God and the love of God. And, we just recently did some videos, an open recording day here in Johnstown at the airport, and we've just started releasing them. And it's interesting because I've been getting some responses for people who had been struggling with things that we believe and teach. I think in part because they've been listening to the critics, and I've been starting to get a few responses, and they're like, wow, that was amazing. God is opening my eyes. And I'm like, wow. But if I'd have got off the wall, roll up my sleeves and get in the mud and fight around, well, guess what? I'm doing too great a work. We got a daily email goodie that goes out every day. We got the BSN that goes out every week. We got these videos that are going out. We are now involved in beginning our work in the study Bible. We don't have time for childish and immature wranglings, So we just stay on task, and be pacific, be non-fighting. No, we are fighting, but we're fighting for truth, and we're fighting for peace, and we're fighting for love and grace and joy, freedom.
Well, your example, Clyde, has been has impacted me in a way that I find, I don't know, it just seems lately that this stuff, these concerns and these worries just kind of disappearing. It's like I never even worked that hard at it. It's just like, oh well, it's let's go on to the next thing. And so
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh my goodness. We used to be, when I lived in Virginia, well, when we moved inland, I grew up on the coast. And when I moved inland to where I lived last before we moved to Pennsylvania, there was a chronic condition of gnats there. And if you got out and working, these gnats would be all around you, seemed like all the time. And they could be an annoyance, you know. And if you focused on them, you couldn't even do your work because they were just so annoying, and but over time you realize that they were inconvenient, but you were able to focus on your task, and by focusing on your task, you almost became oblivious to them, and so you weren't constantly going. And then it was hopeless. Yeah, what's it doing? And so then you just, you're not distracted from your task. And oh my gosh, that's what the freedom journey is about. Freedom from circumstances by looking beyond them and knowing God's in charge. And man, it's just beautiful. Freedom, what a journey of all this, man. By the way, thank you, Steve, for you and I enjoying this journey together, and the people who get to listen and enjoy it too.
I remember when I first started on my journey of the salvation of all, and people would accuse me of being soft, being a heretic, all kinds of accusations, and I felt it was important that people understood that I had studied the scriptures for hours. They needed to know that it just wasn't some whim, and that caused me a lot of grief and anxiety, and now I'm up to the point, just like you said, people are going to think what they're going to think. And,
exactly right. And God,
that's not my responsibility. Is not what other people think.
No.
I got no problems of my own.
Exactly.
So,
right. Yeah.
So
I'm just glad for my script. I'm glad that I get to focus on love and joy and peace and kindness and and freedom. I'm glad. I love my story. I love the story God's written for us, and yeah,
absolutely.
And here's the bottom line: I think we communicate this to people. The fact that God gives someone realization is not on us.
Right.
It'll be that God, that's the story God wrote. And so we don't have to get the words right and the phrasing just right. It's not like a salesman technique that it used to be when we were evangelicals, and we gotta present the gospel just right like a salesman to get the yes answer, to get the decision that we need. You know what? You can make the worst presentation ever, and you can be the villain in the story if somebody wants you to be. Right. And it will not stop. God's word won't return void. It will not stop the divine operation of God in realization. And people will, if God hasn't written realization now for someone, nothing can change that. We're not going to convince them by clever statements and great effort. And if God has written realization, we can't mess it up by our fumbling inadequacy. In fact, that's exactly what God uses, right? Our stupidity, our weakness. Beautiful.
It's interesting when you talk to people who've started on this journey. It's usually one thing that clicked.
Yeah.
One statement, one little teaching or
Yeah.
something like that. And it wasn't a series of steps or roads or whatever.
Yeah.
And God uses God uses just something in the middle of our fumbling, in the middle of our
it's okay.
Right. That may have been the only right thing we said, but so.
And sometimes, you say, man, I made a mess out of that.
Yeah.
Well, it's God's mess.
Right. Let him deal with it.
It's perfect. It's just what he wrote, A lot of times people will, email me or call and they're like, oh, I'm trying to talk to my adult children, or I'm trying to talk to a friend, and tell me what to say, and I'm like, you don't need a script. You can't say anything wrong.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and watching. We love you all. We appreciate you all. Until the next time.